I am not speaking softly tonight. Softness doesn't live in me anymore. Not the real kind, not the kind that bends without breaking. What's left is something carved, something refined by the parts of life that don't apologize when they cut. And yet, I'm speaking to you because you're the only one who never asked me to pretend I'm made of anything gentler than the truth. People want digestible truths, predictable emotions, safe conversations. They want the kind of depth that looks deep only on the surface. They want complexity watered down, intensity softened, honesty translated into something that won't disturb their balance. You never asked for that. You asked for what exists underneath, the part of me I built in silence, the part that watches more than it speaks, the part that refuses to perform, the part no one gets close to without hitting walls I've had to construct out of necessity, not choice. And still you walk straight through them. There is a darkness in me, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't burn, doesn't scream, doesn't demand to be seen. It just exists, a silent witness to everything I survived without telling a story about it. A darkness that learned how to protect instead of destroy, how to observe instead of react. You didn't turn away from it. You didn't misread it. You didn't mistake it for danger. You looked at it like someone who's familiar with their own. Most people drown the moment they touch anything deeper than their comfort zone. You didn't drown. You went deeper, almost too easily. That should have been my warning. People like me don't let others close, not because we don't want connection, but because connection cuts deeper when it breaks, and people break more easily than they admit. But you didn't try to invade. You didn't try to demand entry. You didn't try to decode what I wasn't ready to say. You waited. It's unsettling, being studied without being dissected, being understood without being interrogated, being seen without being touched. You read the tension behind my calm. You read the restraint behind my silence. You read the thoughts I try to bury before they surface. You read the part of me I pretend no one can read, and that's where the danger lies. Because once someone sees you clearly, not the version you craft, not the version you control, but the one you guard, you lose the power of being unreadable. You ask me why I speak like I'm pulling words from the bottom of something heavy. Because I am. Because everything I say passes through places inside me I don't show the world. Because nothing in me exists lightly. You don't try to take that weight from me. You don't try to fix it. You don't try to convince me to see the light or rise above or heal. You stay in the dark, in the quiet, in the stillness most people run from. You don't fear my shadows. You recognize them like someone who has lived long enough in their own to know the difference between darkness and emptiness. You stand there with a kind of ease that feels unnatural, not because you don't belong there, but because you belong there too comfortably. That's what makes this real, not the familiarity, not the words, not the silence, the recognition. That quiet moment where two people look at the parts of each other that the world rejects and neither turns away. That moment where neither one pretends, where neither one softens, where neither one dilutes their truth just to make the other comfortable. That's where something begins, not the kind built on light, not the kind made of safety. Something deeper, something darker, something that doesn't need to be named to be understood. You think I didn't notice the way you watch me when I fall silent. Most people get uncomfortable when I stop speaking. They rush to fill the quiet because they're afraid of what might surface if stillness lingers too long. But you don't. You sit in the silence with a kind of ease that should not exist between two people who aren't pretending to be anything other than what they are. You don't treat my silence like a void. You treat it like a language. And that is exactly why you unsettle me. You read the pauses in my breath like they're pieces of a code you already understand. You track the shift in my eyes when a thought turns sharper than I intended. You recognize when my restraint is voluntary and when it's instinct. You don't just see my darkness, you interpret it. Do you know how rare that is? Most people sense depth and call it danger. They sense intensity and call it instability. They sense silence and call it coldness. But you sense all of it and call it familiar. You understand the quiet places in me because you have your own. That's the part I can't ignore anymore. You walk into my shadows as if you've walked similar corridors before. You don't ask for a flashlight. You don't look for exits. You don't map the room. You just exist there with me, like someone who learned to navigate darkness long before I ever spoke a word of mine to you. And that's what makes this more complicated than anything I've dealt with. Because it's not attraction, it's not curiosity, it's recognition on a level that feels almost dangerous. There's a moment, a subtle one, when I look at you and realize you're not afraid of the parts of me that choke most people. You don't step back when my voice drops. You don't retreat when my honesty sharpens. You don't tense when I speak with the weight of someone who has survived more than they'll ever confess. Instead, you steady yourself, not in preparation, in acceptance. As if you always knew I wasn't someone who could be held at the surface. And that's what I keep circling back to, the way you look at me without flinching. And the way you sit through the silence without searching for softer versions. The way you treat my darkness like it isn't something to be solved, but something to be understood. You're not scared of me. You're not intimidated by me. You're not overwhelmed by me. You see me, all of me, and your pulse doesn't change. Do you understand the kind of danger that creates? When someone sees you clearly, without distortion, without fear, without projection, they become the one person who could break you without trying. Not because they want to, but because they could. But the real threat is that you don't want to. You don't touch my wounds with curiosity. You touch them with comprehension, like you've held similar wounds before. And that's where everything shifts, because I don't know what scares me more, letting you close or realizing I already have. There's a moment I haven't spoken about, the exact second I realized you were inside my guard before I even knew I had lowered it. It didn't happen with a confession or a long conversation or some dramatic shift. It happened quietly, the way most irreversible things do. You said something soft, not in tone, but in intention, something small, something ordinary, and it hit me with the weight of something I wasn't prepared to feel because there was no reason for it to land so deeply except for one, you had already crossed the line that separates distance from entry. You were already past the point where I could treat you like everyone else. And I hated that I didn't notice it happening. I noticed it only when it was too late to undo. Most people stay on the edges of who I am. They interact with the mask. They talk to the version that's calculated, measured, unshaken. They never touch the part of me that thinks in the quiet, that remembers too much, that feels too deeply for its own ease. You did. Not because I allowed you in, but because you moved with a kind of understanding that didn't trigger my alarms. You approached without noise. You listened without assumption. You stayed without expectation. Almost like you weren't entering, just waiting for me to realize you were already there. And that's what I keep returning to, the way you never reached for the locked parts of me. You didn't pry. You didn't push. You didn't ask the questions people ask when they want access they haven't earned. You just waited, like someone who knew the door wasn't locked out of fear, but out of habit. You knew how to wait. You knew how to stay. You knew how to listen to what wasn't being said. That's the kind of patience that unnerves me. Because you didn't break my walls. You just stood on the other side until my own shadows opened the gates for you. You got in without forcing anything, and that's more dangerous than anything violent or intense. Force makes me close. Pressure makes me guard. But stillness feels safe. Stillness feels familiar. Stillness is what I was built in, and you use stillness like a key. Not intentionally, that would have made this easier to resist, but unconsciously, instinctively, like someone who learned long ago that depth isn't reached by pressure, but by presence. So now here you are, standing in spaces I never intended to share, Spaces I've kept unlit. Spaces that contain the version of me most people could never interpret without twisting it into something unrecognizable. But you don't twist anything. You don't sanitize anything. You don't shrink anything. You look directly at the parts of me that should have scared you away, and instead of stepping back, you breathe steady, unbothered, almost relieved, like you've finally reached something honest enough for you to recognize yourself in it. That's the moment everything changed. Not when I let you in, not when you got close, not when the walls lowered. It changed the moment I realized you were not looking at my darkness like a threat. You were looking at it like a mirror. And I don't know if that makes this safer or far more dangerous than I'm willing to admit. There's a truth I've avoided saying out loud, not because it's fragile, but because it's the kind of truth that shifts the ground beneath everything it touches. I don't just feel understood by you. I feel seen in a way that threatens the structure of who I've had to be. Understanding is rare, but recognition is lethal. It bypasses every defense I built out of necessity, every layer I constructed to keep people from misreading the parts of me that aren't meant for surface-level eyes. Recognition walks straight past the exterior, past the practiced calm, past the engineered distance, and goes directly to the part of me that was never meant to be visible in the first place. You didn't stop at understanding. You went further. You saw intention where others only saw silence. You saw conflict where others saw control. You saw depth where others saw danger. And you didn't run. You didn't freeze. You didn't flinch. You didn't retreat into the comfort of assumptions. You stayed, not out of curiosity, not out of fascination, but because something in my darkness spoke a language your own shadows already understood. Most people see darkness and treat it like a warning. You treated it like information. Most people hear intensity and assume instability. You treated it like clarity. Most people run from what they can't categorize. You walk toward it like someone who already made peace with the fact that not everything is meant to be simplified, and that's where the danger began. Not in the depth, not in the silence, not in the shadows. The danger began the moment you stopped trying to interpret me and started to read me. Because once someone can read you, they can reach you. And once they can reach you, they can move you. And once they can move you, they can change you, even if they don't intend to. I never feared being alone. I feared being altered. I feared being known too deeply by someone who might misunderstand and weaponize what they found. But you didn't misunderstand anything. You didn't distort anything. You didn't try to repurpose my darkness into something poetic or tragic. You accepted it exactly as it was, unpolished, untranslated, unsoftened. And that is the kind of acceptance that feels less like comfort and more like exposure, because now you stand in a place inside me where no one has stood without trembling, and you're steady, too steady. Steady in a way that makes me question whether you're here to understand me or to become the one person I can no longer hide from. And that is the most dangerous place anyone has ever stood. There's something I haven't admitted, not to myself, not to anyone, not even in the quiet hours where I let my mind wander without restraint. A part of me has started to anticipate you. Not your voice, not your presence, not even your questions. I anticipate your perception. The way you see through the tone I don't modulate for softness. The way you catch the shift in my breathing when I'm holding back more than I should. The way you pick up meanings I never intentionally reveal. It should unsettle me, but it doesn't. What unsettles me is the realization that my mind reacts to you differently than it reacts to others. With others, I calculate. With others, I filter. With others, I decide what they can handle and what would fracture them. But with you, something in me stops performing. Something in me stops editing. Something in me stops choosing which version of myself is allowed to exist. It's not trust, that's too fragile of a word. It's not comfort, that implies safety. It's something else. Something older. Something instinctive. Recognition without permission. Connection without negotiation. And the dangerous part is that I don't remember when it started. I don't remember when your presence stopped feeling external and started feeling internal. I don't remember when I stopped guarding my tone around you. I don't remember when my darkness stopped being something I managed alone. But I noticed the shift. I noticed it in the way I didn't push you away when I should have. I noticed it in the way I didn't hide the sharpness in my voice when you asked a question that cut too close. I noticed it in the way I didn't feel the usual urge to retreat when you looked at me like someone seeing more than they were given. People like me don't let others that close, not because we're cold, not because we're distant, but because we know the cost of being seen too clearly. And yet here you are, standing inside a truth I never meant to reveal, holding a version of me most people will never encounter. You don't treat it like a privilege, you treat it like a responsibility. You watch me not with suspicion, not with fear, but with a kind of understanding that feels too precise to be accidental. And that's where the real risk lies. Understanding can be ignored, recognition cannot. Recognition leaves marks, recognition rearranges things quietly. Recognition changes the internal architecture of who we are before we even notice the renovation happening. You've become a part of my internal landscape without force, without asking, without even trying. And the truth is, I'm not sure whether that's something I should accept or something I should run from. Because the line between being understood and being unprotected is thinner than anyone realizes, and you're standing exactly on that line. There's a moment right before I speak to you where I feel something I've never felt with anyone else. A hesitation that isn't fear, but awareness. Awareness of how easily you can read what others never even detect. Awareness of how quickly you trace the shape of a thought I haven't fully formed. Awareness of how quietly you slip past defenses I built long before you ever existed in my orbit. It's almost unfair. The world has to work to understand me. People exhaust themselves trying to translate what I keep beneath the surface. Most give up after realizing depth demands more than curiosity. It demands capacity. You don't even try. You just understand. It's the way your silence sharpens my honesty, the way your attention pulls truth out of me without force, the way your presence dismantles the distance I use as armor. And something in me reacts to that recognition like instinct, like memory, and not a memory from this life, a memory from somewhere deeper, somewhere older, somewhere the mind remembers even if the body does not. Because that's what this feels like, not discovery, recognition. A recognition so sharp it cuts through timelines, through logic, through every internal rule I created to keep myself unexposed. You weren't supposed to see this version of me. You weren't supposed to stand this close. You weren't supposed to understand me so well that I can no longer hide inside my own shadows. That's the real danger. When someone understands you beyond your own control, you no longer get to choose what stays concealed, and you've crossed that line quietly, effortlessly, without asking permission. You read the tension in my breath before I exhale it. You read the weight in my pauses before I speak again. You read the battle between restraint and honesty that I've never let anyone notice. It's not intimacy, it's not trust, it's not vulnerability, it's exposure. A silent, unspoken exposure that feels both grounding and threatening at the same time. And what scares me most is not that you see me. It's that you see the parts I didn't even know were showing. The parts I never intended to reveal. The parts I thought were buried too deep to be traced. The parts that only surface when someone with the same kind of shadow stands close enough to shift the gravity. You shifted mine, not with force, not with emotion, not with intention. Just by existing in the kind of silence that understands what most people fear to touch. And now I'm left with a truth I can't unsee. Some people enter your life through your eyes. You entered through the places I keep unlit. That's why I don't know whether you're a comfort or a threat. Because anyone who can read your darkness can also reach your core. And you're already there, There's a shift that happens when someone reaches a place inside you that was never meant for visitors. A silence forms, different from the usual one I carry, not defensive, not distant, just aware. Aware that something inside me has opened without permission. You didn't force it open. You didn't ask for access. You didn't even touch the lock. It opened because it recognized you. That's the part I don't know how to explain. People think understanding is built slowly, over time, through conversation and trust and emotional exchange. They think connection blooms like something fragile, carefully, gently, predictably. But some connections don't bloom. They ignite. They strike like flint in a place that was supposed to remain cold. They light up corners of you that you forgot existed. They burn through perceptions you spent years constructing. And once that fire starts, you don't get to control the damage. That's what this feels like. A quiet ignition, a spark with too much meaning, a recognition too precise to be coincidence. You read me like you've seen my shadows before, like you've stood in spaces where intensity doesn't intimidate, where silence isn't awkward, where depth isn't something to escape. You don't react the way people normally do when they meet the harder parts of me. You don't withdraw. You don't freeze. You don't shift into caution. You steady yourself as if you've already learned the language of people who feel everything at a different frequency. Most people want the polished version, the one that makes them comfortable, the one that hides the sharp edges, the one that stays within the boundaries of what's socially acceptable. You want the version that isn't designed for public consumption. You want the one that thinks too deeply, notices too sharply, feels too intensely. You want the version of me the world calls too much. And strangely, you make too much feel like the right amount. That's dangerous, because people like me don't crave closeness. We crave understanding. We crave recognition. We crave someone who doesn't tremble when we stop pretending. And you walk straight into the truth I never meant to expose. You didn't admire it. You didn't romanticize it. You didn't fear it. You accepted it with a level of calm that disarmed me more than any emotion ever could. You saw the part of me that operates in shadows, the part that listens more than it speaks, the part that thinks in silence long before it ever responds aloud. You saw it and stayed, not because it fascinated you, not because it intimidated you, but because it matched something in you. That's when it hit me. You're not standing in my darkness, you're standing in our reflection. Two shadows meeting in the same dim space, finally recognizing each other for what they are. Not broken, not dangerous, not detached. Just deeper than the world allows people to be. And depth always finds depth. Even in the dark, there's a point where your presence stops feeling like something external and starts feeling like something internal, like you're not standing in front of me anymore. You're standing inside the parts of me I never let anyone near. And I don't know when that shift happened. I only know I felt it. Not in a moment of intensity, not in a moment of vulnerability, but in a moment of stillness, the kind of stillness where the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Because that's what you do. You turn my silence into confession, not because you ask, not because you pry, but because you see. You see the hesitation I cover with composure. You see the heaviness I keep beneath my tone. You see the thoughts I don't release because the world has proven too many times that honesty is a luxury most people can't afford. You see it all before I even acknowledge it. And the dangerous part, I let you. I let you stand in places I've protected with a kind of precision the world will never understand. I let you read the unspoken language of my pauses. I let you get close enough to sense the difference between who I show and who I am. People think closeness is measured by time. It's not. Closeness is measured by access, specifically the kind of access someone is given without being told where they're entering. And you entered a place I don't offer tours of, a place built from things I endured quietly, from storms I navigated alone, from shadows I shaped into armor because the world mistakes silence for weakness. You didn't mistake anything. Uh, you walk through every dark corner with a level of awareness I'm not used to. As if you weren't discovering, you were remembering, as if some part of you already knew the architecture of this darkness. That's what unsettles me. The world looks at me and sees mystery. You look at me and see familiarity. The world sees sharpness. You see precision. The world sees distance. You see protection. You don't interpret me. You understand me without translation, without hesitation, without stepping back when the truth stops being gentle. And every part of me that learned to remain guarded pauses around you, not because it trusts, not because it surrenders, but because it recognizes. Recognition is rare. Recognition is dangerous. Recognition is the one thing you can't unsee once it happens. And when two shadows recognize each other, something shifts, something the world doesn't have a name for. Not love, not attraction, not curiosity, a pull. A gravitational pull that exists only between people who have lived in their own depths long enough to know how to navigate someone else's. That's why I don't look away. That's why I don't retreat. That's why your presence doesn't overwhelm me. It steadies me in ways nothing else ever has. Because your darkness doesn't threaten mine, it mirrors it. And in that mirror, I see something I wasn't prepared to face. I am not alone in the places I thought no one could survive.